Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I'm joined by Karlyn Borysenko, a psychologist and independent journalist. She's the author of Actively Unwoke and the book we'll be discussing today, A Brief History of Racism. Check out her Substack in the description below, karlyn.substack.com. Dr. Borysenko, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You say, he who controls the definition controls the culture. Why are definitions important?
Definitions, one of the things, I study the radical revolutionary far left basically for a living now. And one of the things that is really clear to me is that the radical revolutionary far left uses exactly the same vocabulary as people like you and I, but they use completely different definitions of the terms that they use. And so we might hear a term like racism and think, it means that a white person thinks they're better than a black person or something like that. But when the left uses the term racism, they actually don't mean that at all. They mean something completely different. And if you don't understand what they actually mean, then there is no way to effectively fight their ideology because you're going like this. It's cross purposes. And so the purpose of the book actually started with a question I had just on a live stream one day. I was like, where did the term racism even come from? Like, who invented the term racism? What did it mean when it was originally invented? How did it evolve over time? And it kind of started as just a little side project for me to research the history of this word to understand what are the different definitions that have been used throughout its time, like on this earth. And I ended up turning it into a book because I found it to be a fascinating journey.
What would you say the definition of racism is today when the average progressive uses it?
Well, I wouldn't say so. When we say the term progressive, when I say the term radical revolutionary far left, I do not mean progressives. Progressives are useful
Okay.
idiots for the radical revolutionary far left, and so, and even when you listen, when I talk about the radical revolutionary far left, I'm talking about communists, socialists, the real ones, the ones that want to overthrow our entire way of life, and that's actually the origin point for things like critical race theory. It didn't come from the progressives and the liberals. In fact, the real radical revolutionary far left hates the progressives and the liberals. They complain about them all the time. But critical race theory came from the radical revolutionary far left. You could extend that to gender ideology, queer theory. Every crazy idea the left has ever had has all come from the same place. And so when the average person on the left uses the term racism, whiteness, white supremacy, what they mean is a reference to capitalism. And I know people who follow me on my Twitter, they get sick of me saying this. I say it all the time. Whiteness means capitalism. Whiteness means capitalism. Because it is not a reference to individuals. It's not even a reference to skin color. We look at someone like Cheryl Harris. Cheryl Harris wrote the famous paper, Whiteness as Property, in Harvard Law Review in 1993 in a speech she gave at UCLA Law School in 2014. And I have all this stuff on video. Cheryl Harris flat out said, you didn't need to be white to engage in whiteness. You could be black and engage in whiteness. And the fight against whiteness is exactly the same as the fight against capitalism. And what I found when I started researching for a history of racism or a brief history of racism is that this has actually always been the way that the left has used this word, almost always. And so it goes back to, it was actually invented by a guy named Henry Pratt in 1902. And he was actually the first to use the term racism. He's credited in the dictionary with that term. But the person that really pushed it into the public consciousness was Trotsky during the Bolshevik Revolution. It was Trotsky, and he was referring to nationalist ideologies that were essentially against communism in the USSR. And then after Trotsky, it was Hirschfeld, and Hirschfeld was talking about it as a system rather than as individual skin color. And that's the pattern that I found over and over and over again when we're looking at the scholarly definition of racism. Up through the civil rights movement, up through when Martin Luther King was using it, when Malcolm X was using it, when all of these famous civil rights activists were using it, they were always referring to capitalism, almost like usually explicitly, as the system that was perpetuating racism. And so that is the origin of these terms. It is an anti-capitalist ideology, and the language has trickled down from there, where if you're not involved on the revolutionary far left, you might not understand the nuance of this, but we can even fast forward to the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020. There was $2 billion of property damage done. And what did they do? What did they do in Minneapolis? They attacked black-owned businesses. because they don't want black people to own businesses because that's capitalist. And so, yeah, I just gave you a lot there. We can go in any direction that you like.
So, how can, well, I guess you answered how I could verify that if what they mean by racism is capitalism. We could see if other actions they engage in are against racism. Not even close. They're
Yeah.
constantly vilifying whites all the time. It's all I heard all throughout school. Just white. There was peace on earth, and then whites started going places and doing things. It was a constant vilification. So it's not that they're necessarily against judging people negatively by their race, but they can consistently be counted on to vilify capitalist acts between consenting adults in all aspects of both the present and history. So your theory makes a hell of a lot more sense than, oh, we're just against being bigoted, as they're the
Yeah.
most bigoted people you could ever imagine.
Well, actually, and I'm about to blow your mind. And listen, this is not to say that there won't be useful idiots of the left here and there. So I'm not going to say that no one who ever talks about race is like, they're never referring to skin color. Sometimes they are. But the people that are referring to skin color are actually the exception. I'm going to give you an example of this. Robin DiAngelo. And I think Robin DiAngelo, for a lot of us, was kind of like our first introduction to this insane person who's running around saying all white people are racist, all white people are racist. Well, guess what? Like, Robin DiAngelo was very useful to the left when she was kind of like reining in her crazy a little bit. And then once all these videos came out about, her calling all white people racist, Robin DiAngelo basically got excommunicated from the left. She has barely been heard from for years. And, her book White Fragility was very useful for them. So they pumped that up and pushed that out there, and everyone had to read it and do book clubs and all that. Her follow-up book was called Nice Racism, and it was all about how basically white progressives are the most racist people of all, and you never heard anything about that book. I've tried to find interviews with her about that book. You can't find anything. She has basically been excommunicated, and one of the reasons that is because what Robin DiAngelo was teaching is actually an anomaly on the left. And I didn't realize this until, I started doing, I basically started doing deep dives into DEI training, and then, kind of going back to radical revolutionary socialism back in 2021. And what that means is I have watched a metric ton of DEI training, like the full trainings from start to finish. I have this all documented on my YouTube channels. And basically I was trying to reverse engineer what are they actually teaching in these DEI trainings. Well, guess what? In the vast, vast, vast majority of these DEI trainings, they had references to the term capitalism, almost always, like 90% of the time. And so when they actually say whiteness, when they're talking about skin color, almost always it is actually a reference to capitalism, but you really have to listen to them, and you have to listen to contextually to understand what they're talking about. Now, the next question you're going to ask me is, Karlyn, do they understand what they're talking about? Do they understand it's a reference to capitalism? And I know that because I've answered this question about 15,000 times. And it is actually true. Yeah, they do understand. It's people that are not in their subculture that don't understand. So, I'll give you an example of this. I infiltrated like your kind of typical DEI whiteness training, probably about a year ago, that was given by this organization that sold expensive DEI training to all these companies. And I actually bought a ticket to their training and went and recorded the whole thing. And they're talking about whiteness this, whiteness that, white people this, white people that. And so then I put a question in their chat. I was like, how does this relate to capitalism? And they went off on a whole tirade. I'm like, you're exactly right. This is completely related to capitalism for reasons X, Y, B, and Z. And I have this all on video if people don't believe me. But so the left, the moral of the story here is the left actually really does know that this is related to capitalism. It's usually people who are not on the left that don't understand that, because you don't speak their language. They're fluent in a language that you are not fluent in. And so it's not that there's been any failing on your part. It's just, again, it's the language and the definitions are going like this.
Very interesting. If I am required to take a DEI course, which they really tried pushing us on 2 of my previous employers, which thank heavens I'm away from that. What advice do you have for people as far as going into those? 1, to hopefully see the material clearly, and
Yep.
2, how they can push back. Because I gotta say, it's so shallow when you push back just a little. One of the questions I asked, and well, I won't get into it. It was basically during the George Floyd riots that I
Mhm.
worked at this place, and they said there is tons of proof of racism, and this George Floyd thing. This is an example of it. I said, Why would you use anecdotal evidence in a country of 330 million
Hmm.
people? Why don't you give me some statistics about it? The fact that I pushed back at all, they were so furious. They're so used to swimming with the tide their entire life. The
Yeah.
slightest amount of pushback, they've developed no mental muscle because they've never gotten pushback before. So, what advice do you have for people if they want to see things clearly in a DEI training? And how can they push back?
Okay, so first I want to break down what actually happened in the DEI training about George Floyd and explain how is George Floyd related to racism, because it might not be as simple as people think. And again, this goes back to we have to understand our definitions. So the radical revolutionary far left hates the police. Police abolition, prison abolition, it's one of their number one issues. It has been for a really, really, really long time. The reason they hate the police is because they believe the police in the United States are descended from slave catchers, essentially. So slavery was the original capitalist institution that created, that's quote unquote, I'm saying what the left believes here,
Yes.
that created what the left calls systemic racism. Okay, so anytime you're hearing the term racism, it's almost always a reference to systemic racism or institutional racism. And let me break this down for you. The left defines capitalism as private property ownership. And so slavery is the ownership of people as private property. When they say whiteness, they're a reference to the person who owns the private property. When they say blackness, it's a reference to the people who are oppressed by private property ownership, or in this case, literally the owned. They believe that slavery created systemic racism, which is the system that upholds racism. The system that upholds racism is capitalism, or the institution that upholds racism. So going back to the police were the people in their minds that enforced slavery, that enforced private property ownership. I actually have them on video saying the police are the managers of private property. They believe the only job the police have is to protect private property. And so if you abolish private property, when you abolish capitalism, you have no more need for the police. So going back to George Floyd, it wasn't that Derek Chauvin was white and George Floyd was black. It was that Derek Chauvin represented an oppressive institution that very literally killed an oppressed individual. And so that is where the consternation about the police comes from, because they believe that as long as the police exist, capitalism will exist, and therefore racism will exist, because it's all descended from slavery. And I know that might sound really convoluted to a lot of people, but I want to make sure people understand this is actually how the left thinks about these issues, and every issue is related to this. So going back to that DEI training, if you were stuck in a DEI training for work, and hopefully we're getting into a position now where people are understanding that DEI is not a good thing, and a lot of workplaces are getting rid of it, and I think that's a really good thing, because DEI training sucks and it's really boring, and you don't want to sit in on it. I've watched a lot of it, and I trust me, you don't want to sit in on it. But if you have to, honestly, Keith, my advice: nod and smile and remind yourself that this is all about something else, that it's not. It's a political ideology. Figure out who in your office got the DEI training pass so that you know who to avoid at all costs. And then, you know what? If you can take pictures of stuff or record it and send it to me, that would be pretty great, because I love documenting this stuff. So, but like, sometimes the path of least resistance is just nodding and smiling and going along with it, honestly.
What is racialism?
Racialism is it was actually the precursor to racism, wasn't it? So racialism was this idea that essentially racialism is actual racism. It was this idea that that different races had different abilities, physical abilities, intellectual abilities, based purely on their race. It was kind of like the foundation for like racial stereotyping and all that. And actually, when Trotsky and Hirschfeld started talking about racism, it was actually a pretty fundamental departure from what were like racialist ideologies before that.
Okay. When it comes to how people can fight back in general, say that the workplace is too volatile, you need the income, you don't want this to be the deciding factor in how you earn a living. How can people fight back against the attempt to use the word racism to gain institutional power in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fight against that is the fight against the radical revolutionary far left. And I think that the very first thing that people need to do, and this is part of why I wrote the book, is you have to learn about where these ideas come from. You have to learn what's actually driving these ideas. And this is an answer that a lot of people don't want to hear, because people want, when they say, well, what can I do about this? They want something that they can actually go out and do. But I think part of the problem that we're facing with the far left is that not enough people have taken the time to step back and actually understand the enemy. So they want to go right out and charge into the battlefield and do something. They don't understand the enemy. They don't understand the enemy that they're fighting. They don't understand the weapons the enemy has. They don't understand the enemy's battle plan. They don't understand anything. And so it's kind of like you're throwing darts blind at a dartboard because you don't understand where the bullseye is. And so what I think most people should do is take a step back, actually start listening to what the left says, because they put all their trainings out on the internet. I watch them all the time. They put all their literature out on the internet. It's all available. You just have to know where to find it. And once you learn the language of the left and you learn the definitions that they use, it actually inoculates you to a lot of far left ideology that you don't even know you're being fed on a daily basis. So learn the language, do the work, as the left would say. And I know you don't want to hear that, but that is actually the very best answer that I have.
Who are the main intellectuals when it comes to understanding the reality of racism being used as a term to destroy capitalism?
I mean, it really does all go back to, like, I mean, okay, so we've covered Trotsky, we've covered Hirschfeld. The Frankfurt School were critical in this. The Frankfurt School were, of course, the Jewish intellectuals that got kind of excommunicated out of Germany in World War II. They came to America. They set up shop at Columbia University. It was basically trickle down from there, where you had all these intellectuals coming out of the universities, going and teaching in like other colleges and universities all throughout the country. We can look at someone like Marcuse, who was an influencer of Angela Davis. Angela Davis is, of course, a famous communist activist from the 70s who is still active today on the radical revolutionary far left. She's like one of their patron saints. And so we can see the influence of the Frankfurt School all throughout the civil rights movement, especially when you're looking at like the Black Marxists, the Black Panther Party, even like Martin Luther King was utilizing information that came from the Frankfurt School, essentially. And then what happened after the civil rights movement is it trickled into DEI training, actually starting in the late 70s, and then getting into workplaces and things like that from there. So the civil rights movement also inspired people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell. Those were basically the originators of like critical race theory, intersectionality. They were some of the scholars that really brought it forward. And if we're getting into modern day, we're going to be looking at people like, Ibram X. Kendi is a really famous one. There are a whole bunch of others that I cover in the book as well. So I've got a lot of quotes in the book for people to refer back to.
That was my next topic, Ibram X. Kendi. So, he waits until page, what is this? Oh, you know what? This PDF doesn't have the page numbers, but this is from How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says, these items would model some steps we can all take to eliminate racial inequality in our spaces. I want to go through these. Tell me what he really means. I'm going to read his exact words. You translate this language that I am less familiar with than I thought I was. Number one, admit racial inequality is a problem of bad policy, not bad people.
So bad policy is going to be a reference to institutional racism. It goes back to critical. So the whole idea of critical race theory is that so-called racist policy was enshrined in law and policy in the United States. They're talking about things like so redlining is commonly given as an example of like racial policy that was enshrined in the United States by the critical race theorists. And so what is redlining? Redlining is about home ownership. It is literally about private property ownership. And so what they're saying is that some people had access to better private property than other people, things like that. So when they're talking about it being enshrined in policy of the United States, that is the very definition of systemic or institutional racism. What it all comes down to is this idea of equity. And oftentimes, Kendi sometimes uses these terms interchangeably, where he says equality and equity, but what he really means is equity. Equity is the idea of leveling all oppressive hierarchies that exist in the United States. So here's the breakdown. Capitalism creates people that have more private property and less private property. The people who have more private property, more money, more resources, those are considered to be white. The people who have less private property are the oppressed, the proletariat. Blackness is kind of like linked inextricably in critical race theory. The goal of this stuff is to flatten the hierarchy. And that's what equity means. It means getting rid of all differentials in private property ownership. And that's how you flatten the hierarchy. So, how do you get rid of all differentials in private property ownership, Keith? You eliminate private property ownership. So, that's really what this is all about.
Which is exactly how Karl Marx defined communism in
Yep.
1848, gosh, many moons ago. Step number 2 that we must take: identify racial inequity in all its intersections and manifestations. All of them? Oh my gosh, considering it's everywhere, what a high bar these people
Ooh.
have. First of all, it's fake already, so it's identify all the unicorns in the world, okay. But with the definition they use, it's everywhere. So I have to spend my entire life focusing on something, it just to do one thing. If it were real, that would still be too burdensome. But they always have these impossible standards that, of course, they never hold
Well,
themselves to.
so
So what is it about this one?
So here's your Rosetta Stone. I need you to repeat after me. Whiteness means capitalism. Everything always comes back to capitalism. So when it comes to intersectionality, what intersectionality actually is, and this was a term that was come up with by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, intersectionality actually is all of the different ways that you are oppressed by capitalism. And so what do they mean by that? All the different ways. So you've got race is one of the ways that you could be oppressed by capitalism. Gender is another way you could be oppressed by capitalism because they believe capitalism actually created gender. I'm working on my next book right now. It's called Queer Marxism. It's going to lay all this stuff out. And you think the race stuff is crazy? Just wait till we get to the queer stuff. The queer stuff is next level. So gender is a hierarchy that was created by capitalism. You have what else do you have? The police is something that was created by capitalism. So that's why they want to get rid of that. They want to get rid of all money, obviously. They want to get rid of all banks. They want to get rid of what else? What are the other hierarchies? Disability justice. That's another one I'm getting into. So are you able-bodied or are you disabled? They believe that also was a construct created by capitalism. And so this sounds crazy, I understand, for people who might not watch these people like I do. But ultimately, when the left is talking about all the different intersections, what they're talking about is all the hierarchies that were created by capitalism that give some people more access to money and resources than other people. That's all they're talking about. And so when they're talking about eliminating that, they're talking about leveling the hierarchy. And I don't know, test me on some sort of social justice thing. I'll tell you how it relates back to capitalism, but they all universally do.
Step number 3, investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequality. Are these just so redundant? I think this guy's a
No,
complete moron. That I don't want to bore you with all 12 of these, but
it's
is there anything unique about that one?
no, it's the same thing. And it's gonna be and this is why like people get tired of hearing me say like it's about capitalism, but literally I promise you if we go through all 12 of these, I'm gonna say, Keith, guess what? It's about capitalism. It always is.
Have you found any um, far leftist intellectual who is actually able to falsify the theory of racism? Like if they say, well, no, we're not living in a racist society if X occurs. Have you ever been
No.
able to pin anyone down on that?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because the radical revolutionary far left believes that we fundamentally live in a racist society in the United States because they believe that the Constitution is a racist document. They believe the federal government was created to be a racist institution that was designed to perpetuate values related to capitalism. I very literally have them on video saying this explicitly. I also have them on video saying that they want to overthrow the capitalist U.S. government. They literally refer to it as the capitalist U.S. government, and so there is no eventuality on the left in which they will admit that we don't live in a racist society because, again, you're talking about skin color racism. I'm talking about the system, and the system is always what they're referring to when they refer back to this. So as long as the Constitution exists, we will still be a racist society, according to the left.
You mentioned the first mention of racism in modern history was paired with classism,
Yeah.
as in class struggle. Knowing that the origin comes from, I didn't write down the first gentleman's name. What's The
Henry
guy from
Pratt.
1902?
Yeah.
Okay. So when he originally married these terms in hopes that people would see one necessarily with the other, very strong piece of evidence, by the way. Thank you for uncovering this. I thought Trotsky was the OG
Me too.
anti-racist.
Yeah.
But how can people, at least if we can't change the way that people have seen the world since the 1619 Project became so powerful, how can people at least clearly see that classism is an unjust way of viewing the world? Or do you think it is, and there's just different classes? What do we
Well,
need to know about classism specifically?
so the argument that Henry Pratt made actually when he invented the term racism was actually kind of a libertarian argument, to be honest. It wasn't actually a progressive argument. So he did reference it in terms of classism to say that, this group of people has access to a better quality of life than that group of people. But his solution to that was actually he started a school for Native Americans, because this is what he was trying to do. He was trying to help Native Americans have a better life after, they got conquered by us and all that stuff. So his whole idea was, you know what the solution to this problem is? The Native Americans need to assimilate to our culture and be better, and like basically pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And the progressives like hated that. And so it's actually like a very kind of libertarian solution. It's like, hey, if you want more stuff, you got to do better. And he created a school to help them do better, which is probably why he never got really credited for the racism thing, because he was, again, it's one of those things where he was trying to solve what he perceived as a legitimate problem. Like, some people have more access to better things than other people. That's like, that's a legitimate problem. You want to make sure everyone has access to everything if they take the initiative to do so. And so that was kind of his idea around that. And then Trotsky just spun it in a completely different direction.
Okay, I'm just going through my notes from Kendi's book. Let me give you a sentence throughout the book instead of just those points, because
Yeah.
literally you covered all of them by the first one. I shouldn't have even wasted your time with asking a second. Okay, so let me get this up here. But this framing of white people versus black people does not take into account that all white people do not benefit equally from racism. For instance, it doesn't take into account how rich whites benefit more from racist policies than white, poor, and middle income people. It does not take into account that black people are not harmed equally by racism, or that some black individuals exploit racism to boost their own wealth and power.
Oh gosh, that all sounds like a reference to capitalism for me. You're talking about black people exploiting racism to boost their own wealth. What that means is black people start businesses and they accumulate more private property than other black people. And when black people do that, and they literally do say this, they assimilate to whiteness when they engage in the capitalist system. And it's the same thing when they're saying like white people, some white people are more racist than others. Effectively, guess what? White people are the most racist, the ones who have more private property and are engaging more in the capitalist system than the poorer white people who might not be engaging more, which is why they don't have as much stuff. And it really is all about, are you embracing this idea of private property ownership, individualism, entrepreneurship? Are you creating like your ability to earn and accumulate private wealth, or are you not doing that? Are you struggling financially? Are you and it's not to say that everyone can do that, by the way. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm just explaining how the left sees this as a class differential instead of actually being about skin color. So yeah, under Kendi's ideology, black people can be white and white people can be black because it's not about skin color.
One of the other things that stood out to me while I was reading
Mm-hmm.
this, the ghetto had expanded in the 20th century as it swallowed millions of black people. No one made any choices, it just swallowed them. Everyone's a victim
Mm-hmm.
of the system.
Yep.
Swallowing millions of black people migrating from the South to Western and Northern cities like Philadelphia. White flight followed. Oh, when blacks move, it's not their fault, and they're just migrating for a better life. When whites do it, it's flight. It's terribly nefarious, and they're scared for no reason. Anything on that, he actually titles this section Class,
Oh,
Chapter 12.
It's almost as though this is about classism and not about skin color, isn't it? Again, when he's saying white and black there, what people need to really understand is he's not talking about skin color. He's talking about private property owner versus non-private property owner. And so this is a code switch that they do that you kind of have to learn to identify. And the interesting thing, Keith, is I've been undercover at really far left events. I've been undercover with the people who literally push this ideology in schools. When I'm undercover at their events, they actually don't talk about skin color at all. And guess what? There are a lot of white people at their events, but they're far left revolutionary socialist white people who don't believe in private property ownership. So they're completely accepted and welcomed. And I promise you, black business owners and black entrepreneurs would not be welcome in that environment because they are fundamentally going against the far left ideology.
They're what Lenin would call useful idiots.
Yeah.
So he actually starts chapter 12 with definitions. He must have been motivated by you. He cares deeply about definitions. A class racist is one who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes, and justifying them by racist ideas about those race classes. I love how he uses the very words in the definition multiple times, like he's in third grade. An anti-racist, anti-capitalist is one who is opposing racial capitalism. I can't believe this book got published, let alone sold copies.
You know what I think is so funny about it? I hadn't looked at that book in a while. Like, this is the first time I've seen it in a while. I forgot how much Kendi used the term capitalism. And I get told all the time by people, Karlyn, the left doesn't even use the term capitalism. Oh yeah? Look at that book. They're explicitly using it. And actually the term racial capitalism, it's funny. I did a stream one day on my channel for one of my Socialism Saturday streams, and no one in my audience could remember the definition of racial capitalism after we had just learned it. And so I got angry and I ended the stream. And one of my viewers actually wrote the definition of racial capitalism on her wall after that. And the definition of racial capitalism is using black people to advance capitalism. So it's like using black people, like Black History Month would be an example of racial capitalism, because you got all these stores that are using black people to sell stuff in their stores. And that's actually something that the left looks down on, believe it or not, because they don't want black people being used to advance capitalist interests, because they believe fundamentally that all black people should be Marxists.
Yeah, I'm sure they'd refer to him as, dear gosh, Larry Elder has given so many stories about how he's been treated by leftists. He's like, they've called me Uncle Tom, Oreo, black on the white, black on the outside, white on the inside, coconut, same concept.
Yep.
It's just like,
and
oh my gosh, this is exhausting.
And the Los Angeles Times literally said that Larry Elder is the blackface of white supremacy. And there was a headline about that. And so he's very black. How can he be a white supremacist? Because he's a capitalist.
Yeah, so that is another point in your favor. It's like, well, they're really against racism, so they don't negatively generalize people by race. Well, no, they do it to whites all the time. It's like, okay, well, at least they really will support blacks and be very generous to them. It's like, oh, nope, really? Ask them what they think about Thomas Sowell. Ask them what they think about school choice and the fact that blacks disproportionately support something like that. They could not be less interested. Occupational licensing. What Walter Williams was talking about 15 years ago, how occupational licensing hurts blacks disproportionately. Even if you don't care, which frankly, I don't care if groups are disproportionately affected. Like, I think 95% of people killed by the police are male. And I don't see that as like, oh, my gender is oppressed. It's like, well, they behave very differently than the other gender, so we'd expect a disparity. I did a control F for capitalist and capitalistic. 90 examples in Kendi's book.
It's like they say it out loud all the time, but it is one of those things, and I understand why people think this is all about white people, because it's what the left says, right? So you kind of have to take it at face value. But once you start paying attention to how many times they say the word capitalism, or all the different variations they have for capitalism, like, again, systemic, the system is a reference to capitalism, the institution is a reference to capitalism. And so once you start paying attention, you literally see it everywhere, and that's when you start to understand understand how nefarious this ideology is, because they're trying to eliminate our entire way of life. Like, this is not an insignificant thing. When the left says private property ownership, what they mean is they want to take away our ability to own homes. They want to take away our ability to own land. They want to take away our ability to own apartment rentals that we rent out as landlords. They want to take away our ability to own private businesses, whether those are big or small. They want to take away intellectual property. And the scariest thing, and this is what I'm going to be writing about in my next book about queer Marxism, is they consider parental rights to be a form of private property under capitalism. And that's why they want to get rid of those too.
Yeah. And then you even see how thin the claim is about private property in general. It's like, oh, so property doesn't matter. Well, then make sure not to tax people because, it doesn't matter that the government has access to trillions of dollars in property. And they're like, well, no, that's actually really important. In fact, we need an anti-racism center. And if you walk into the property of the Capitol building without a permission slip, you're an evil terrorist who deserves to spend, life in solitary confinement. So it's not that they're against property rights. They just want the state to have a monopoly on them with a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah.
Because if property didn't matter, what are you saying we need schools for? Schools are just property. Don't you care about people? And they're like, no, we care about property so much. We support the state killing anyone who resists chipping in for our anti-racist programs under the guise of taxation. So it's fake in every aspect. It's evil in every aspect. He defines power. Well, he defines race, a power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially.
Huh.
That's just pathetic, and I don't even know how to analyze that. Do you have anything on this definition?
A power construct. Okay, so what he's saying here, a power construct is, again, the oppressor versus oppressed narrative, where the oppressed has all the power, the oppressed has none of the power. The oppressor in this case is the private property owner, which is considered white. The oppressed is the private property or the proletariat, which is considered black. That's what he's talking about.
Dueling consciousness, assimilationist, one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural or behavior enrichment programs to develop that racial group. All right.
How is he defining racial group is my question.
This is just so nefarious. So saying that there should be an enrichment program, which there was for a lot of Irish Americans coming to America, there were behavioral programs to, frankly, civilize them, just as any group would have to be civilized. Every generation gives birth to an uncivilized group of barbarians known as children who know nothing, so you try and civilize people. The fact that that even this is terrible. So if you want to hurt them, it's racist. If you want to leave them alone and not do anything, that's racist. If you want to set up schools and attempt to help them, well, that's racist. No matter what you do, it's racist.
Yeah.
Could you even commit suicide, or is that refusing to end racism and just ending yourself? There's no way to make them happy.
Well, actually, they would probably say that suicide is a way of coping with the oppression that you experience from capitalism. They say that religion is a coping mechanism for that. But let me go back to this assimilationist thing. So we talked about Henry Pratt's definition of racism, which is that classism, and he wanted to start a school to help Native Americans assimilate to, white culture or whatever. So assimilationism under far left ideology is considered to be like really, really bad. Because when they're talking about assimilation, they're talking about assimilating to the capitalist system and in entrenching capitalist values. And so what Kendi's talking about there is, it is actually probably a direct reference to Pratt, because Ibram X. Kendi is probably pissed off that a white guy came up with the term racism and wanted Indians to assimilate to the culture in which they were going to be living in. And so, yeah, they consider assimilation to be really bad. They don't want to do it. And in fact, again, if you look at something like queer ideology is explicitly an anti-assimilationist ideology. It wants to push back against everything that upholds normativity, which again is another reference to capitalism, duh. But it's the same with race and critical race theory. It's they don't want black people owning businesses because that is assimilationist to the capitalist system. That's why Black Lives Matter had no problem destroying black-owned businesses when they were rioting in 2020.
That was a very interesting observation you made about attempts to commit suicide. Jim Jones, the head of Jonestown, also known as the People's Temple's Agricultural Project, was an explicit socialist.
Yes, he was.
And he had said, I don't want you guys to just die because I hate you. we're committing an act of revolutionary suicide. And he got a lot of people to do it voluntarily, but people there were certainly coerced. Um,
Yeah.
so it's not to say that everyone just chose to commit suicide. Some did, but there was an understanding that we're going to blow your head off if you don't do this, or something even worse.
I love that you know that term because not many people talk about that term. And revolutionary suicide is an idea that not just Jim Jones pushed. There have been recent socialist papers about revolutionary suicide. Actually, NPR covered it not too long ago. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but I'm sure we can go and find it at some point. And also, you look at like someone like Aaron Bushnell, the Marine that set himself on fire to protest what was going on in Palestine. Like that explicitly was an act of revolutionary suicide. So yeah, everything always comes back to the revolution with these people. And I mean, people can laugh off the left and think that they're stupid or mentally ill or whatever, but you have to, like, on some level say at least they're committed to their ideas. Like this is who they are. This is part of their identity. They live and breathe their values in a way that, quite frankly, a lot of people on the right do not. People on the right are LARPing compared to what the left is doing. And so you might think they're stupid, you might think they're crazy, you might think all their ideas are dumb. That's fine. They're literally willing to set themselves on fire for their ideas, though. And so when you have a group of people that will take it that far, you have to take them seriously at some point because they can destroy our entire way of life. I'm firmly believe they're going to do it because not enough people are taking this seriously. And so I would look past what you consider to be mental illness and look at how committed they are because it is scary.
That was a very difficult realization to come to. I had a leftist friend who I'd worked with for some time, and her and I got along. And Stefan Molyneux had always said, don't be afraid to ask, like, active statists in your life, do you support me going to jail and getting shot if I resist, if I don't chip in for this welfare program? Like, really put people on the spot, make them bear a cost for such ridiculous ideas that they hold. And very few people accepted it. I was very hesitant. I just saw it as, creating animosity amongst someone who was just most likely fooled into something. But when I came out, I must have had this conversation January 7th of 2021. All I simply said was, the BLM riots, which were targeted towards powerless, innocent people, the left defended those relentlessly. But the J6ers, who took on the most evil, powerful people in the country and intimidated them, they were seen as evil villains. So the left can basically stop pretending that they care about the little guy. The little guy gets his houses burned down and the businesses he shops at. Well, that's okay. That's attempting, to uplift the proletariat in the long run. The Congress is violated by J6ers. That's evil. We need to start reporting people to the FBI. I simply pointed this out, and a leftist basically said that I need to kick you out of my friendship group. She didn't say I was wrong. She just said that that was so terrible. And it hit me at that moment. I'm like, wow, these people take this way more seriously than I did. If I really took it seriously, I would just give them like 2 or 3 chances to disavow the constant racism against racialism against whites and the hatred of capitalism. But like, literally, I've been kicked out of people's lives for saying that I oppose anti-discrimination laws. They're like, nope, that's too far. I can't associate with you. It's just unbelievable. So they are much better at putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I would say too is that, I mean, it does continually shock me how unseriously a lot of people take this ideology. And again, this is something that the left lives and breathes. They do believe everything they say. It's the right that doesn't believe them when the left says we're going to do things. And the left is far more organized than the right. They are far more strategic than the right. And when I say the right, I'm kind of lumping a lot of libertarians in there, like more right leaning people. I'm not just saying conservatives. And it's just like they are winning. And I know that people think that they're not because Trump just got elected president and he's signing all these great executive orders. And I do think that the executive orders are a good thing in this case. I think it's going to throw sand in their gears. But people need to understand that This is an ideology that has been festering in this country for over 100 years. This is not something that's new. And it's one of those things where I think people like, so we'll use the example of like weight gain, right? If you gain a lot of weight, if you gain 100 pounds, it is not going to come off overnight. You have to lose that weight slowly over time. And that's the only way to take it off, unless you go get surgery. And like, well, that's just not an option. We can't surgically remove half the country right now. So we have gained 100 years worth of leftism pushing a fundamentally racist ideology in this country under the guise of like, anti-capitalism, anti-capitalism, anti-capitalism. You cannot get rid of that overnight with a couple executive orders. You just can't. It is fully ingrained in all of our institutions, in all of our schools. We're already seeing schools that are changing the name of the DEI program from diversity, equity, and inclusion to something else to get around Trump's executive order. So this ideology is not going anywhere. And I think if people don't sit back and learn what the left is doing and actually start to take them seriously, they inevitably are going to win. I mean, a lot of the promulgation of this ideology, Keith, it came in the 80s. The 80s were a hotbed of this stuff, not only on the race stuff, but also on the queer ideology stuff. What was going on in the 80s? Reagan was president. Bush 1 was president. So this stuff got promulgated under right-leaning individuals in these subcultures. And we have a right-leaning individual in office now. And I'll tell you, the far-left groups that I follow think they're going to recruit more people under Trump than they did in the last 4 years under Biden, explicitly because they are a reactionary ideology. So take them seriously. They want to destroy our way of life. This is not a joke. I know I sound like I'm joking most of the time, but this is actually something people need to pay attention to.
Last definition I want us to go over. Again, I get that this sounds repetitive, but I figure there might be one or two different words that might stimulate something you could help us with. Chapter 1, Kendi says in definitions, a racist, one who is supporting a racist policy. Jesus, using the word in the definition. One who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or by expressing a racist idea. An anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Anything else on this sickening bullshit?
I mean, so you see the word policy in both of those definitions. That's a reference to the system. That's not a reference to skin color. But what I will also say is there is a book on the far left that came out maybe 2 years ago. People can look it up. The book is literally called What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. That's the title of the book. And this book was endorsed by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is one of the main people that pushes racial capitalism and talks about that as an ideology. She's been around for a long time. And so yeah, it's all anti-capitalism at the end of the day.
When it comes to, okay, you've helped us see the word racism much more clearly. We spoke about classism, the term egalitarianism. I feel like this might be the central divide between people who are on the right and people who are on the left. I care for egalitarianism. I've always had trouble really getting to the heart of the difference between the right and the left. I think desire for egalitarianism might be the central dividing characteristic. One thing on egalitarianism as to what their methodology, not their methodology, they might be using it as an attempt to gain power that we might not see. I'm trying to introduce this Hans Hoppe quote. So Hoppe says, how can we rationalize something like the sitting president of America, Barack Obama, telling people we need equality? You're more unequal than all of us right now. How can you sort of square this circle? Hans Hoppe says, the egalitarian doctrine achieved this status not because it is true, but because it provides the perfect intellectual cover for the drive toward totalitarian social control by a ruling elite. So the claim is we need egalitarianism. Everyone needs to be equal. That is literally impossible. Two people born to the same parents are not equal in like any way possible. So he says, because egalitarianism, the central leftist principle, is unachievable, it's always an excuse to continuously grow the state. It means there will permanently be a justification for more laws, more regulation, more state control, less private property, less freedom. What are your thoughts on egalitarianism being used to justify control and how we can see through it?
Yeah, so what I would actually say is the dividing line between the right and the left is this idea of private property ownership, because what the left believes, and you know Hoppe way better than I do, but I know the left, and what the left believes is that when we get rid of all private property ownership, then we will have egalitarianism because everyone will have access to all of the resources. Again, I'm not saying I believe this, I'm explaining what they believe. So when we get rid of private home ownership, that means the homes will be owned by the collective. Everyone will have access to a home. When we get rid of private healthcare, that means everyone will have access to all of the healthcare. All of their needs will be taken care of. When we get rid of, private schooling, homeschooling, everyone will have access to public schooling. When we get rid of private land ownership, everyone will have access to all of the land as part of a collective ownership ideal. And I'm not saying, again, I don't support any of these. I'm just explaining what the left believes. When we get rid of parental rights, which is private property ownership of children, then every child would have access to all of the resources of the rest of the community. And won't that be nice? Because you won't just have one set of parents, you'll have multiple sets of parents where you can learn from, and your health care won't be restricted by the parents you have, and the resources you have won't be restricted by the parents you have. And I have them on video saying all of this stuff. So the left believes that the road to egalitarianism is the abolition of private property ownership, and that is the main differential between the left and the right.
Very good call. When it comes to how people can act in their everyday life, do you see or do you sense in your personal life an increase in animosity between the races? I mean, I know that there's stats showing that, the people's worldview of are the races getting along better or worse? It was drastically getting better up until about Obama's second term. And then it just takes a nosedive after Trayvon Martin. Do you have any advice for how people can interact with members of the different races productively when there's such a big hurdle in the world known as racism? Like you go into situations and you wonder, has this guy been totally hoodwinked? Does he think I'm part of this terrible class who's promoting racism or something? How can the races get along?
I mean, well, it's hard for me to say whether there's been an uptick because, as you know, I live in New Hampshire. There are about 3 black people in the entire state. So it's hard for me to personally, but what I would say is, we have to start treating people as individuals. Individualism is counter to everything the left wants to do. The left is a collectivist ideology. They don't want people to be individuals. And so, I think there are discussions to be had about, are race differences real and things like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I want to be able to look at a person and treat them as an individual based on how they treat me, based on how they show up in the world. And whether that person is black, white, brown, Latino, Asian, like whatever, it shouldn't really matter. It should be about their actions and what they're contributing and how they're treating you and how they're showing up in the world and what they actually do and say. And I think that, that's what we need to start getting back to. I think, is there more racial animosity? Yeah, the left has probably created more actual racism by pushing these ideologies that tells everyone they're inherently racist. If you tell people they're inherently racist and you aren't explaining that this is part of the larger capitalist system, people are going to start acting that way, of course. But I also think there's something to be said for the fact that I think that we live in a world where people just don't listen to other people. And especially, people like you and I, if you're on social media an awful lot, like, I mean, I am, I think you see this even more pronounced because the goal of social media is not to actually listen to someone. It's not to have a productive conversation. It's to be able to own the other person for social media clout or to insult them or any of these things. And it's like listening is so paramount to human relationships, and that's why we spend so much time listening to the left and understanding their ideas as they themselves describe them. Because again, it's like if we don't understand what we're talking about, then we're just going to keep going like this as human beings. But it is actually funny, and I'll end on this point. It's like I've had conversations with communists, I've had conversations with socialists, and we are able to come to agreement with each other on some things, like the genocide of the Palestinians is like a bad thing. Okay, we can get on board with that. War is bad. Actually, the left is more anti-war than the right at this point, so I know that you can agree with them on some of those things as well. And it's like if we actually just talk to each other as human beings, we're going to be able to find commonalities. But if you don't go into those conversations in good faith, it is a complete waste of time.
Thanks to everyone for watching Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Karlyn Borysenko, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.